Well, good evening, everybody. Let's get started. It is great to see a full house of in-person attendees. Yay! Pardon?
There's a lot of people on the screen.
This is true. This is true. Even more on the screen. So welcome to the 7th installment of the History of American Architecture lecture series. For those of you that may not know me, I am Greg Whitcup. I have the pleasure of serving as the director of the Center for Collections and Research. So before I thank our sponsors and introduce our speaker, I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us this evening, whether in person or online. Through your registration fee, you are helping support the work Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research does to preserve and share the history of Cranbrook's rich legacy, including our remarkable architectural legacy. You are part of an audience of nearly 500 people, of which a high percentage of you, that's you on the Zoom screen, are joining us online. Even as we schedule our signature campus tours, dinners, workshops, and in-person lectures, let me assure you that the center will continue to offer online programming, including our most popular Kevin Atkinson's History of American Architecture lecture series. So before I introduce our guide, I would like to thank our sponsor, the Smith Group, including the firm's cultural studio leader, Rodrigo Manriquez. Although they are a global architectural firm with offices around the world, their roots are here in Detroit, where an architect by the name of Sheldon Smith opened an office in 1855. I had the pleasure of working with the firm when they restored this Sarnan designed art museum and worked with us to create the new collections wing, now over 12 years ago. I would also like to thank our friends at Cranbrook Academy of Arts and Art Museum for hosting us tonight here in DeSalle Auditorium. It is always a pleasure to be back in this space. So as the series unfolds over the course of the next 4 weeks, I plan to share with you a few highlights of other ways that you can get involved at the center. But today, I think I should simply introduce our speaker, the curator and architectural historian that will be guiding us through Detroit's architectural legacy. It's a story that many of you have heard, but there may be a few familiar or unfamiliar faces in the audience here. Kevin Atkinson joined the center in 2016 as our collections fellow and quickly rose to the rank of curator. While I think of Kevin as a Renaissance man, a curator whose intellectual curiosity is seemingly boundless, his passion is for architecture and the built environment. A native of North Georgia, Kevin holds a BA in architecture from Yale and an MA in American material culture from the University of Delaware's prestigious Winterthur program. Before coming to Cranbrook, Kevin worked for Robert A.M. Stern Architects in New York as a research and writing associate and at Kent Bloomer Studio in New Haven, where he designed and fabricated architectural ornament. Over the course of the series 5 lectures, you will come to find him to be a knowledgeable and engaging guide to American architecture as it took form here in Detroit. In short, you are in for a treat. Take it away, Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg. And thank you, everyone, for joining us at home or wherever you are and watching along. And then thank you, everyone, for coming out here to DeSalle Auditorium at Cranbrook. It is really great to be back here under our new, much brighter lights. I am really looking forward to this series. I remember when I started doing this 7 years ago, I felt like such a fraud. I had the biggest case of imposter syndrome, and perhaps, though I would never admit to such, I overwhelmed you with the amount of slides in order that no one question if I knew a building or not. We may have resolved that issue, maybe not. But I have a new sort of lack of familiarity with this subject, and I will be the first to admit that I am not a Detroiter. I am not currently, nor have I ever been, a resident of the city of Detroit. Unlike a lot of you watching, I wasn't born in the city. I don't have family from this part of the country. I grew up in Marietta, Georgia. And so it's interesting to be a historian at Cranbrook and a curator here in the suburbs of one of the most interesting, dynamic, and troubled cities in the United States. Because to do a history of architecture, Detroit in the world, but from our rather cozy seat of Bloomfield Hills, can be a little bit of a mind meld. Are we in the city? Are we looking at the city? I hope that everything I do is with an eye towards teaching, towards learning, and with enormous respect to the architects, designers, people past and present who live and work and make the city special. Now, in the case of many of these buildings, I know that a lot of you will know them. Hopefully you have visited them and you're learning more things about them than you knew. Some of the buildings I'll show you've probably been to multiple times, maybe even worked in or maybe even worked on as an architect. And it's entirely possible that you know vastly more about individual architects and individual buildings than I do, looking at those of you who have written books on the subject matter who signed up for this course. Thank you in advance to everyone who is here to celebrate and examine and study the architecture in the built environment of Detroit. I say that as a way of leading in to say, if I get something wrong, if you don't agree with my opinion, send me a note, send me an email, send me a Q&A here on the Zoom, or follow up after the lecture. I would love to learn more from those of you who have lived and worked and know these buildings even better. When I applied for this job 7 years ago, or 7.5, 8, oh my gosh, there was something about Detroit that was at one point, and one point, It was a city that was on the rise. I had other friends who had moved to Detroit, but then I also had a lot of people, particularly of my parents' age, who said, why in the world are you going to Detroit? Are you going to be safe? Are there even jobs there? There is this deep darkness that you can find about the idea of Detroit when you are outside of Southeast Michigan. I think it's entirely unfounded. And I, like many other young creative professionals, have found a rich and interesting social and sort of aesthetic, dynamic life here in the Metro Detroit region. The books about Detroit can't help but sort of examine it as a social phenomenon. It is a city that is made up of a lot of architecture, but it's not quite Chicago, where you have a sort of cult following of Detroit architecture, nor is it a city that is easily explained by just looking at the sort of dynamics of ebbs and falls, sort of big markers in time. Instead, and I love this quote, Detroit is just America with the volume turned all the way up. What happens in Detroit is happening and will happen over and over again across our very capitalist United States. Here, Henry Ford brought mass production, mass population change, mass sort of immigration, and a whole new industry, the automobile, that radically transformed the nature of America's 13th smallest city into the 4th largest city, and then way, way back down to a small city again. The fact that we're able to have these sort of population and physical changes over such a short amount of time, since 1900, is much more dramatic than in other cities, but it also is a demonstration of what capitalism, what sort of this American life is bringing to many different American cities. I'm reminded of what they say in Cleveland, at least we're not Detroit. That's a little bit smug, but there are lessons to be learned here about what happens when a sort of unbridled capitalism, architecture, and a city are sort of left to experience really wild swings in time and space. Now, I'm grateful to Luis, a student in our graphic design program who made this year's poster, who created this sort of frenetic collage of buildings. It makes me think of when you're driving around Detroit at night and buildings and darkness are sort of interspersed when lights are going off. Maybe you're at a rave, maybe you're at the fireworks, maybe you're just sort of looking at the architectural illumination. There is a certain excitement to Detroit's architecture in the context of what the city looks like on the ground. And I would say that Detroit looks unlike most other cities. There is a vastness to its 140 some odd acres that is relatively empty. And even if we were to go back to whatever supposedly golden era there you choose, 1930, 1950, it was still a pretty empty city. It is a city that has been made up almost exclusively of single family homes, very little apartment dwelling here in Detroit. And it's a city that has always been sort of unencumbered by the flat terrain. As the city has expanded physically, it has also expanded sort of architecturally without the density that comes from being on an island like Manhattan. And so the experience of Detroit today is one of intense urbanity, an almost apocalyptic post-urbanity. There is a sense of rural agrarianism in the city. There's a sense of cozy suburbanism. There's also a sense of dynamic urbanism. And I think all of these things we have to hold true at once because the city is made up of so many different types of neighborhoods and types of characteristics that seem to be forever in flux. Now, where exactly are we in relation to the Great Lakes? We are on the Detroit River, downtown Detroit, Hart Plaza, where Cadillac landed in 1701, is right here at the intersection of a grid of radial streets, the longest of which goes all the way to Chicago along an Indian Trail. Cranbrook is way up here along Woodward Avenue. And then the city of Detroit is somewhere in here. Its rather amorphous boundaries aren't marked by any sort of great shift in time. The city seems to go on forever. More broadly, we are here in, do I count as a Michigander now if I start using my hand to tell you? You know, Detroit is way down here in one corner of a very large state. Half of the state is the Lower Peninsula, most of the population, but the resources that define the rest of Michigan are what drove the economic engine of Detroit. 4 out of 5 Great Lakes choose Michigan, and this sort of shipping channel that runs through the Detroit River has been vital to the success of Ford and the other industries that made their home here in Detroit. But of course, we are not the first peoples here. This is Anishinaabe land. And though the Europeans had been here since 1701, it wasn't actually until 1807 that the US government signed a treaty with the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi people, ceding the land from the Anishinaabe to the Americans. So it's a very recent city. It's a very new city because for most of its early history, it was just a sort of ramshackle fort. And I won't be too ambitious as to talk about the architecture of early Detroit. Other scholars have done that more thoroughly and with deeper interest than I. But this early architecture of the French colony and the British settlement, the American settlement, the British settlement going back and forth was really impermanent. These were fur traders. They were material traders. It was an outpost. It was a sort of protect some other part that was more important. And so Detroit was a very sort of literally combustible place to be in the 18th century. It's why by the fire of 1805, we eliminate the first century of Detroit. By the mid-19th century, the sort of structures haven't gotten much more permanent. They're still eclectic, majority wooden, sort of reflecting the frontier nature of Detroit at that time. However, things were beginning to change. Detroit was really a place where industry wanted to flourish, where people wanted to bring in the fur trade and then to bring in lumber and iron and steel. They began to make stove and stoves and pharmaceuticals, so that by the time we get to 1900, when our lecture series will ostensibly begin, Detroit is a place that is making a lot of things, that is on the up and up, that I think felt very proud of itself, like multiple Midwestern cities, called itself Paris of the West. And it was sort of on the verge of something great, but who could have predicted what that was? Here is a picture of Cadillac Square in 1900 with the great Wayne County building, probably our greatest Baroque building ever built in Detroit, designed in 1897, completed in 1901. Looking out over a sort of hodgepodge of eclectic Victorian architecture on these sort of garden lanes. At this point, Detroit's population was barely cresting 100,000 people. The majority of population growth would come in immigrants and from people relocating from the South to Detroit to look for work. There was also, I think, a sort of charm to Detroit. And since you might not have it handy, I just looked into the Handbook of the City, written in 1899 by a Silas Farmer. In it, the Dictionary of Detroit, he says, advantages: our location on the Detroit River, many and exceptional. Homes are attractive and numerous. The air and atmosphere are as fair as those as Italy. The position is favorable for constant growth. Floods, we have none. Our river never overflows nor dries up. Shady streets, we have an unusual number, and morals of Detroit will compare very favorably with any city of its size. And important to all of us, burial caskets are produced in large quantities. It was, I think, a great time to be in Detroit, but it was also a moment of impending cataclysmic, cacophonous change. In 1899, Detroit would have its first auto show. It was staged by a Mr. William Metzger, a former bicycle salesman who had become the city's premier auto dealer. He had 4 cars on display, 2 electric and 2 steam. Within just a year of that first auto show, Henry Ford would begin tinkering and set up his company within the first years of 1900. And then we were really off to the races. Now, why didn't this happen in New England? They were making bicycles. They had all the technology. Who knows? Maybe it is sort of the magnetism that came from Ford, that came from Ransom Olds in Lansing, Michigan, who would move Oldsmobile to Detroit fairly quickly. But time and time again, people interested in the horseless carriage, in the automobile, began to repeatedly choose to relocate to Detroit. Eventually, we have the French racer Louis Chevrolet making his way to Detroit via New York. We have Walter Chrysler coming. He was the son of a trained engineer coming from Kansas, came to be a manager at Buick and then started his own company. The Dodge brothers would come to Detroit and set up shop. And eventually you have this kind of amazing set of enterprising engineers, inventors, and mechanics who are ready to set out and make modern Detroit. Now, what that actually means is an enormous period of growth for the next 30 years. From 1900 to 1930, Detroit would undergo almost unbelievable change. A population increase of 500%, going to become the 4th largest city in the United States. It would also increase from about 28 square miles to close to 140 square miles as it ate up the surrounding regions. It also became a city that was much more ambitious in scale than its sort of shady lanes and enough caskets, as it began to think of itself on par with any great cultural capital in the United States. Tonight's lecture, I'm hoping to show us how we can go from this lovely model on the right with her Model T to this model on the left in 1941 with her Ford Super Deluxe. It's a very compressed time period we're looking at, just about 1900 to the mid-1930s, and yet it is going to show us this sort of transformational change that arrived in Detroit. One moment here. Thought I could manage pretending that this scroll pad was working, but it wasn't. Okay. So we have this anticipated change. We are a little frontier town with big ambitions. And like most great cities, we are ready to sort of prove ourselves to the world. And there is going to have to be a driver for how this happens. And that, of course, is the technology of the automobile industry. Now, when Henry Ford sets up his first shop, he goes to the legendary architecture firm, what we now know as Smith Group, to build his first Paquette Avenue plant in 1904. And what's interesting about this little plant that starts off Henry Ford, one of his early vehicles there in front, is that it is essentially a New England mill. This is a building typology that has been around for close to a century at this point, but now in a new sort of setting, the Midwest, and for a new function, the automobile. But it is not serving Henry Ford's needs well at all. And so he turns to a young architect by the name of Albert Kahn, who is going to help envision this new Detroit and really set the stage for the transformational changes that define this city. Albert Kahn had been born in Germany, raised in Luxembourg, immigrated to Detroit as a young teenager. He had 8 little siblings. His parents had been fine in Europe, very poor here in Detroit. His rabbi father was running a restaurant. Albert was helping to bring patrons in as they would exit the train station. He didn't go to school. He didn't study architecture. Instead, he began to work as a shop boy, got fired from the first architecture firm because he smelled like the horses that he was cleaning up after before he would go to work at the architecture firm. Eventually, he gets hired into the firm of Mason and Rice, one of Detroit's leading architectural designers. And so Albert Kahn sort of works his way up through skill and talent and grit and sketching to become the lead designer of Mason Rice. Before becoming so financially sort of stable, he's able to send his younger brother Julius off to the University of Michigan to study engineering. This will stay critically important because the Kahn office is really never just Albert Kahn. Last year, we spent 5 happy weeks looking at Frank Lloyd Wright, an architect who would prefer no one ever be mentioned in his same breath. Albert Kahn's not like that. Albert Kahn is a team. In 1938, Architectural Record would say, where is Albert Kahn and where is Albert Kahn Inc.? They are one and the same. And so Albert Kahn, his brother, his associates, they begin to tinker and invent and experiment in reinforced concrete. Concrete had been around since Roman times, reinforced with various methods. It's incredibly strong as a sort of compression material, but once you begin spanning distances with concrete, it wants to shatter. Think of sort of how weak plaster of Paris is. Essentially, when you get to the scale of a beam, concrete with nothing inside of it is not going to hold anything but itself, if that. Since the mid-19th century, architects have been experimenting with how to get iron and then steel inside of concrete to reinforce it. What the Kahn brothers discover, particularly Julius Kahn and his Trust Concrete Steel Company, is a way of rolling the steel so that it grips the concrete and then bending it at a 45-degree angle. So they begin to sort of interlock each other like interlocking arms. The concrete is poured atop and it doesn't pull apart, it doesn't spall off, it doesn't expose to the elements, and the building becomes extraordinarily stable, extraordinarily light, and extraordinarily flexible. Now, the first time that the Kahn brothers sort of take this revolutionary concrete idea and apply it to a building is with the Palms apartment down in Detroit, one of the first reinforced concrete structures in the United States. Now, you wouldn't really know that just by looking at it. If it caught fire, I suppose you would be very grateful, but it's not really taking enormous advantage of the Kahn Trust system. A year later, Albert Kahn designs the West Engineering Building at the University of Michigan, this time taking better advantage of the Kahn Trust system because it includes things like a naval practice pool that is having to support this enormous sort of liquid weight in the middle of the building. From here, though, we get to the Albert Kahn revolutionary Detroit architect, because the next year, Kahn designs the Packard Building number 10. And here is Detroit's first reinforced factory and the first major contribution of this frontier town to the wider world of architectural history. Here, Albert Kahn has essentially replaced the building with anything recognizable as architecture. Gone are sort of classical ideas about ornament and columns. Gone are really any sort of permanent idea about wall, or even sort of the architect dictating what the wall needs to be. The wall here is glass and brick. It could just as easily be glass all the way. It could be brick all the way. It could be fabric, wood. Who cares? The structure is entirely independent of the wall. Instead, it is all these 32 by 60-foot grid of concrete columns and concrete beams, allowing the workers inside to have this sort of airy, light factory, much more flexible as they build cars, as products change, as skills change, as things, what's happening in what corner of the factory change. The building is able to accommodate all of this sort of activity without interrupting it, as those old mill-style buildings would, with their dark windows, or their small windows, dark interiors, and lots of columns. Henry Ford instantly recognizes what the Packard Tin building means for architecture, and he commissions Albert Kahn, again, Julius as the engineer, to design the Ford Highland Park plant on Woodward Avenue. Now, Highland Park is an enclave in the city of Detroit, carved out by Henry Ford for all sorts of reasons, including taxes, and it is built right along Woodward Avenue. But I love these construction photos because it shows you how a Kahn building really is just column and floor. It could be wrapped with absolutely anything from this point going forward. Of course, this is right on Woodward Avenue, and so Kahn does give it some more architectural elements, these sort of heavy brick column corners, these limestone detailing, and then I love the sort of wagons and horses in the foreground, because what else would they build the building with? I mean, they're about to build a car factory, so it's not like they have the car. And really, this is right at the turn of the century. So it is essentially a 19th century building trade making what will define and enable the 20th century. Now, when Henry Ford completes his Highland Park plant, opens it in 1910, really fully operational by 1912, 1915, it is a massive project. This is a drawing in Cranbrook Art Museum that shows the Highland Park plant from the administration building, and then the power plant, then the sort of sales and director level, and then all of these factories, just this endless grid of Kahn's architecture. But what intrigues me about it is that in architecture history, it is celebrated as this, distinct revolution, that this is a new way of building. And yet, Albert Kahn actually wraps the building, particularly that side that faces Woodward Avenue, in a very beautiful sort of civic architecture. It's symmetrical. It has these symmetrical smokestacks and water towers. It does have these lovingly added details. If you zoom in on this drawing, you can see the individual metal pieces even have what seem to be Gothic tracery cast on them. For an architect who becomes sort of so closely identified with functionalism, with architecture reflecting the exact need, these little elements, these sort of happy squiggles, these moments of ornament where the building is doing something that the car did not ask the building to do, I think show Albert Kahn's attention to architecture as traditionally understood, that he really isn't a revolutionary in taste-making, and instead he's making Henry Ford a very handsome, very modern factory, but still one that has a sort of civic presence towards Detroit's main thoroughfare. In actuality, these pieces from the painting of the building then appear on the actual building, because I had to double check when I started noticing them that they actually were there. And in the end, I started looking at the Highland Park plant with a whole new sort of eye. If you don't see it as a sort of ever-expanding concrete grid, it is a kind of wonderful, whimsical Victorian fantasy, especially once all the windows start opening. It has this kind of frilliness to it that I'm not sure Albert Kahn was exactly intending, but which I certainly find delightful, and which I think goes back in time to other architects who use technology in radical ways to continue a conversation in architecture without breaking directly from the past before them. Thinking of Le Brust in Paris, the first use of sort of architectural iron, where walls of stone and traditional arches are then lined straight down the center with a row of iron piers. These columns then support the barrel vaults, which could be purely functional. And yet, Le Brust gives them these very decorative patterns, these sort of line work, these geometric forms. He is ornamenting the structure. The structure is entirely new, and he is giving it a way to talk to architecture before and after it. Or even more, the experimental architect Ledoux, who is really working in this bizarre, really interesting space of technology in traditional architecture. And I see the ways in which Albert Kahn is a little bit doing the same thing. He's built an enormous industrial plant. He has used a radically new and successful engineering system, and yet he's made the building be a good neighbor, be sort of interesting architecture. Henry Ford, I don't think, comments on this. Instead, Henry Ford realizes the problems of a multi-story factory, which is that you have to have this amazing space, the Highland Park Craneway, to begin moving your goods between different levels of the factory. And so Henry Ford is looking at inefficiencies in the system. He's looking at how he can make cars faster and cheaper and with less sort of interruption in the making of the car for the movement of the car. And he's then looking at his site in Highland Park, which is becoming surrounded by the city of Detroit. He has limited property and will not be able to bypass that. And he realizes he needs a whole new type of an industrial center. And so he begins to purchase property in Dearborn, Michigan. And with his architect, Albert Kahn, they create the world's largest industrial site. The Rouge plant became the largest industrial complex in the world by 1930. It was self-sufficient and self-contained industrial city. By 1927, it had 93 different structures, 90 miles of railroad track, 97 miles of conveyors, 53,000 machine tools, 75,000 employees, and was constructed on 2,000 acres of land. It is massive. And from this, all sort of ideas of tying the architecture back into a civic identity are gone, because where is the city? Henry Ford has created his own city, his own references, and has truly allowed Albert Kahn to create a purely industrial architecture. There's enormous beauty in the Rouge plant, sure. There's beauty in the scale, beauty in the sort of construction, in the dynamism. And then as many different artists would discover, here Charles Sheeler, there is beauty in this sort of new 20th century, distinctly American landscape, where Albert Kahn and Henry Ford and the engineers have calculated what's the exact angle of a ramp, of a conveyor, to then drop the product that we need to drop it at. Well, there goes the next piece of equipment. What is the exact way that we move whatever comes out of that piece of machinery to the next one? Well, then there goes the next site. There is a rigor and an honesty and a sort of hyperfunctionalism to the nth degree driving the architecture. And I find the Rouge just completely unabsorbable in my head. And so I love that in this case, the Ford Motor Company had an artist come in and paint over it and sort of aestheticize it. So you can begin to see that they are individual buildings, because when you just look at pictures that survive, it is really an indecipherable industrial accomplishment. But importantly, it's also all on one level. Henry Ford has realized the advantage of working across one level, being able to expand in all directions. And this becomes Albert Kahn's way of working. Of course, Albert Kahn doesn't just work for Ford. He works for all of the automotive industries. He works for all types of manufacturers. And probably his most famous factory comes with the Dodge half-ton plant in Warren, built in 1937, where here in this famous photo by Hedrick Blessing, we have the sort of icon of industrial architecture at its godliest moment, where all it is sort of surface of glass, enclosing space, this light roof above, a sort of brick wall enclosing it, and then empty industrial workspace on the inside. It is this culmination of an industrial engineer's idea of sort of exploiting light, exploiting air, and conquering space. And on the inside, Albert Kahn has created a system of beams that begin to support all the building systems. So you have nothing in the way on the floor, you have nothing being channeled around the ground, everything is coming down from the ceiling, and that includes even the restrooms. So instead of the restrooms getting in the way, you walk up to them, again, that open space. Now, this is 1937. In 1938, Albert Kahn becomes just the second architect to get a full feature issue of Architectural Forum after Frank Lloyd Wright. At this point, Albert Kahn is a bona fide industrial architect celebrity. He is also at the helm of the largest architecture firm in the country. In 1938, he has 400 employees, 40 secretaries, stenographers, typists, and clerks, 15 accountants, 90 mechanical and electrical engineers, 50 field superintendents, 38 specification writers, expenditures and estimators, and 175 architectural designers and draftsmen. It is a huge workforce that spans multiple cities, multiple continents, and there's in the Architectural Forum article an organizational chart showing how Albert Kahn is able to do it all. Albert Kahn said, architecture is 90% business and 10% art. As someone who did not know Albert Kahn before I moved to Detroit, I would say I look at the buildings and I see 90% business and 10% art. And as shocked as you are that I've, slightly jabbed Detroit's hero, it really shocked other architects that an architect would say this, that an architect would say, hey, I'm building buildings and I'm not making works of art. But Albert Kahn had witnessed a transformational change out of Detroit and across the world of factories that were compounds, that were multi-story brick buildings, dense, hyper-specific architecture for specific tasks, into an industrial architecture that just occupied the maximum space available, and then whatever needed to happen could happen within that roof. Albert Kahn's designs were built all across the country in hundreds of cities and in many different countries, including extensive time spent in the Soviet Union. Here's a copy of Stalin's first 5-year plan from the Albert Kahn archives at the University of Michigan. Albert Kahn and his brother set up a shop there in 1930 and stayed until 1933. Albert Kahn only ever visited with his wife, while others lived full-time in Moscow. They complained about working conditions, they complained about living conditions, they complained about the food, but most of all, they were shocked at the sort of underdeveloped state of architecture professionalism in the Soviet Union. They couldn't find drafting tables, let alone drafting tools or ink, pencil, paper. All of this they were having to bring with them. Meanwhile, the Soviets were sort of cranking young men and young women into the studio to learn drafting skills, to learn Kahn's methods, so that they could go out and complete the 500 factories that Albert Kahn and associates would build in the Soviet Union in this 3-year period. Now, it wasn't just the Kahns who were in the Soviet Union. Kahn described himself as slightly more left than left, but he wasn't a communist. I mean, he is capitalism's architect. But the Soviets were also sending designers back to Detroit to study our operations here. And then there were, in addition to Albert Kahn and his on and off 30, 40 employees, some 2,000 to 3,000 American technical experts, engineers, draftsmen, people helping with this 5-year plan in the Soviet Union. Now, Michael Hodges, who writes extensively about Albert Kahn, says that it is Albert Kahn who we have to thank for freedom in the Western world, because it is these factories, the Soviet Union's first factories, that will start making tractors, quickly start making tanks. And so as the Russians are able to hold off Hitler's army and engage the Nazis on the eastern flank, while the British, French, and Americans are winning the war from the western flank, yes, it is Albert Kahn's factories that enabled the Soviets to be able to put up a fight in World War II. What's tragic about this story is that eventually Stalin will decide this was a terrible idea, or who can get into his mind, but he murders the majority of people who worked with any American consultant, including most of the people who studied with the Kahns. Now, as the factories are transferred into new designers and new leaders, they begin to question, how does a comrade work in a factory that is so different from the Russian values in architecture? And they begin to, in the sort of later days, add gardens and tea houses, cafeterias, and other sort of perks of the job of the factory. I mean, these formal gardens next to the factories. So interesting, this idea that, you know, the American factory was simply too austere. It was creating inequality. It wasn't really an architecture you wanted to belong in. And so they begin to alter Albert Kahn's hyper-efficient vision. Now, from there, we begin to see other architects in Europe. Everyone's visiting Albert Kahn, everyone's visiting the Rouge plant. Henry Ford had tours from the construction site on. And so you begin to see the legacy, the impact of Detroit on the wider world. Whether that is in Italy, where you have the wonderful Fiat factory, where unlike Henry Ford, who started the construction in Highland Park on the upper floor and the car rolled off the ground floor, here it's reverse. They start with raw material on the first floor, and then by the time they get to the roof, your Fiat is ready for a test drive around the track. Albert Kahn thought this was incredibly hokey, that it really just is sort of completely is a gimmick, that it doesn't make any sense. It's not how you would test the automobile, then you have to get them down. You know, it's a PR and marketing stunt. I might argue, isn't everything the auto industry does a PR and marketing stunt? And this is a pretty compelling one. And I do think that there is something joyous about these little mechanical creatures when they come to life after, you know, mere hours, days before being raw materials. And so even in Detroit, watching the cars come out of the factory at this sort of phenomenal clip is a very dramatic event. Why not heighten it with the architecture? But Albert Kahn stays focused on his mechanical systems, his ways of creating ventilation and light and air in the very hot forge shops, ways of venting the building through a new roof construction. And then other architects looking from Europe back to Detroit and building their own landmark factories, like Peter Behrens's turbine factory, which is sort of highly aestheticized, very beautiful building, landmarked within an inch of its life by the German people, because it is such a significant work of architecture. If only our dear Albert Kahn could have some landmark status thrown his way every once in a while. It is this factory that becomes a clear guide to bringing modern architecture from industry into every aspect of design. And the people who go to work for Peter Behrens include Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, Eliel Saarinen is in the studio for a month. So Behrens is this figure doing industrial architecture inspired by Kahn, pushing it into a more aesthetic form, and then creating another generation of architects who will make their own contributions to factory architecture, which begin to look a lot like what we see as high modern architecture of the 1920s. This is the sort of birth of the international style through a direct lineage from Albert Kahn. Now, Albert Kahn really criticized Walter Gropius's shoe factory here. He said the corner windows are pointless and will make the factory workers cold, that there is no sort of logic to where these masses are, that the factory, you know, why isn't it one level? That all of these decisions are made, I think Kahn would have argued, more like a cubist painter arranging abstract objects in a field of space than as a planner, as an architect laying out a factory. Of course, this will help launch Walter Gropius's career before he becomes the founding president of the Bauhaus. Gropius loved Kahn. He even had pictures of Kahn's buildings on the wall of his office at the Bauhaus. Kahn didn't pay it back, though they did meet in Detroit. Now, from here, we can compare Gropius's work to some of Albert Kahn's later work. Because when he starts going into the suburbs, when you start getting closer to town again, that impulse to again make your factory a sort of agreeable, handsome architecture can take over. And so I think that though Albert Kahn criticizes the sort of decorative factory, he too is capable of making still a very beautiful industrial architectural monument. Now, he continues to build at just an incredible pace, over 2,000 buildings by the time that he dies in 1943. And these later buildings become even more abstract, these sort of planes of glass. And I think that we can really see how the sort of post-war landscape of American modern architecture is going to be defined in part by adapting these forms, adapting these black and white images into new areas of architecture. Here, Mies van der Rohe, the last president of the Bauhaus, working in Chicago to design a sort of campus of perfectly detailed Albert Kahn boxes across a park-like landscape. Then there's the problem of who is looking at these buildings and who is talking about them. We're looking at them tonight in the context of a hopefully happy architectural history course. I'm looking at them as an architecture historian and a critic. And these are not the people Albert Kahn was designing for. So when critics like the English architectural historian Raynard Banham says, "What's so exciting about seeing this in person? We should have stayed 7,000 miles away." He said, in real life, the Packard plant looks cheap and nasty, an inadequacy of detailing. It is an air of grudging meanness. I mean, there is a certain sort of cruelty that comes to the actual building versus the idea of the building. And I think that Kahn was never really trying to build an architecture for the critic. He was building an architect for the client and for the city. And I think that's especially true when you look at some of his other factory type buildings, like the Ford Motor Company Engineering Laboratory, where you have this sort of beautiful stripped classical entrance onto a really elongated, classically inspired facade, behind which is just another Albert Kahn factory. But because it is the engineering laboratory, because it's a sort of more august part of the Ford complex, Kahn very deftly and very beautifully applies a classical order across the facade. Now, lots of architects try and take Greek and Roman architecture and splay it onto totally new scales and new forms. Few do it with the sort of gracefulness that Albert Kahn does. It's the sort of eye of a studied hand, someone who has measured buildings in Europe, who has studied history, and then can apply it with respect. This is not a begrudging wrapping of an otherwise perfect factory. This is a better building for the purpose because of this classical architecture. And I think Kahn would say the same thing applies when he starts doing university buildings, which are really concurrent with the factories. What about a university isn't a factory? You need flexible space, open space, light, air, fire resiliency, efficient sheet construction. But it's the University of Michigan, so rapid and nicer tapestry brick, give it the Indiana limestone detailing. At the University of Michigan, Kahn really comes to define the central campus. I think his best building is the Hill Auditorium, which takes the sort of cues from the Prairie School of Architecture in Chicago and brings into the auditorium quirky details like these column capitals and bricks turned this way and that, all wrapped around one of the most magnificent acoustical spaces in all of America. And yet Kahn's factory nature, the sort of fact that it doesn't take an expert to tell you that that's an Albert Kahn factory masquerading as a science building, begins to draw some critiques from particularly Michigan alumni who say, why is our campus not more beautiful? I'm sending my son to Princeton. And so you look at what else is going up at Michigan at the same time, whether it's the Brothers Pond of Chicago, their beautiful sort of Gothic Art Deco Michigan Union. And then Albert Kahn is sort of pushed by the university, billed as a factory that doesn't look so much like a factory. And so again, he turns towards classicism and he gives this sort of robust civic structure here at Angel Hall. Of course, go around the back, it's just another factory. And I think what really those alumni wanted was what York and Sawyer gave with the Cook Law Quadrangle. They wanted the university to look like every other university that was tearing down and rebuilding in a sort of Gothic or colonial manner. Now, I think that was just too much for Kahn, or else he didn't want to do it. Michigan doesn't stick with it past the Cook Law Quadrangle. But in his best building at the University of Michigan, according to many, the Clements Library, Kahn does show what a hand he has in able to switch styles entirely into a little sort of Renaissance palazzo taken directly from Florence and plopped down in Ann Arbor. But I think what would have been perhaps more interesting for the university, more interesting for Kahn, what if he had followed the track that he began for George Booth in the Detroit News Building, where, as this article on the architecture of Detroit calls out, it's industry clothed in limestone, the highest type of the development of an industrial building. And it really is, I think, Kahn at his best integrating a new sort of transitional stylistic design around his revolutionary structural system. Now, across the top of it, this is built by Cranbrook's co-founder, George Booth. And so like everything at Cranbrook, it has inspirational figures and quotes, great printers, and great sort of words of the free press. It is a remarkable little building by Albert Kahn that he doesn't really follow up with, but which points a way that architecture is beginning to go, particularly with the wealth that is being generated in Detroit. What are the buildings that we are going to build downtown? When we escape the suburb, when we escape the confines of the factory, where is our money going to go? What is the city going to look like? Because that's the sort of flip side of Detroit inventing a whole nother category and dominating 80% of automobile manufacturing in the entire world, is that we now have an enormous amount of wealth in the city. Is it evenly distributed? Absolutely not. There's no unions at this time. There's abject poverty, overcrowding. It is a world of haves and haves not, but the haves are going to start building and rebuilding the downtown. And what's the category that they'll want to be building in? The skyscraper. And this is a very critical moment in the story of architecture. Let's be real, in the story of Cranbrook, because the moment in time where Detroit has money and has the need for tall buildings is also the moment that tall building is changing, radically shifting from the sort of palazzo of Chicago, where you had a base, a middle, and a cornice. Instead, through this pencil and ink drawing by Eliel Saarinen, a Finnish architect, we see the future of tall building in America. Now, this is just a drawing. It was never built. It came in second in the competition for designing the new Tribune Tower in the city of Chicago, but it made the rounds in the architectural press. It was so successful that it brings Eliel Saarinen, his wife Loya, and their 2 children to Chicago in 1923, and then to guest professorships in 1924 at the University of Michigan. And it's while he is here in Michigan at the university that Eliel Saarinen proposes a grand plan for downtown Detroit. Oh, that it were to have come true. We see here the skilled hand of a European master. Eliel Saarinen has practiced architecture for some 25 years at this point, doing major projects throughout Helsinki and the Nordic countries. For Detroit, he proposes a new way of taking advantage of the riverfront. In the earlier centuries, the Detroit River was virtually inaccessible from the city of Detroit. The property was entirely privately owned up and down the shoreline. There were working docks, then there were docks that had fallen in disrepair. It is where the homeless and the prostitutes, it's where the gamblers were. The riverfront was not a place that you wanted to be. And the great critique as city planners began to sort of evaluate, what are we going to do with this booming city, was no one realizes Detroit is on the waterfront. We don't act like we are a waterfront city. What if we just move all of that, or we have moved all the industry out of the sort of shoreline of Detroit? Let's replace it with civic structures, with concert halls and symphonies, operas, a sort of city-county skyscraper modeled after Saarinen's Chicago Tribune Tower. Though this would not come to fruition, Saarinen's idea of a skyscraper tapered towards the sky, the sort of quintessential Art Deco form, will populate all across the country, whether that's Raymond Hood's American Radiator Building in Bryant Park, or in Houston, the Gulf Building, or here in Detroit, the probably closest we get to Saarinen in Michigan, the David Stott Building. Saarinen's towers begin to appear all around the country. His designs are adapted and manipulated as really a new architectural form. There were not buildings that looked like this before Eliel Saarinen. After his 22 drawing, it becomes the dominant way of building tall building in this country. Yet again, Detroit influencing the rest of the country. And that's a very generous claim of Detroit since he drew the drawing in Finland, but we'll claim Eliel Saarinen today. And so when you look at what Saarinen has proposed for Detroit and then think about what happens, we have big auto companies, big banks, big investments in the roaring 20s. And so we get the Fisher Building, proposed here in its entirety by Albert Kahn. Of course, only part of this was built. This is the Fisher building that would eventually rise. None of this ever happened. And Kahn takes advantage of the fact that this site crosses 2nd Avenue. And so the construction starts. Again, Detroit, a city of mostly wooden, mostly single-family homes, and out in a quote-unquote new center, a skyscraper. And this tower is rising in the sort of conglomerate of executives of the Fisher body plant and General Motors headquarters. And when it's completed, it is one of the finest Art Deco skyscrapers ever built. It features a decorative sort of Gothic spire that upsets many European critics who say, oh, it would be the most modern tower in the world were it not to have that hat. But again, I think Albert Kahn knows what he's doing. And to my eye, the balance, the grace, the light, the sort of whimsy of the tower as this sort of fantasy escaping towards the cloud, it needs to have that little reference to the past. It doesn't need to just be a sort of craggy mountain jetting out. Let it be this sort of tower, this conversation with architecture that comes before it in a totally new architectural form. And you could get to it in totally new ways. Like every building before it, you could walk or you could ride straight into it in the parking structure that was built into the complex. Looking back out down the street, you can see Detroit's other great innovations like the red light as traffic is beginning to take over our new city. And then on the inside, Albert Kahn works with the Cranbrook sculptor Geza Marotti, most famous here for his carvings around the Cranbrook School for Boys. Marotti designs the ceilings, which are then executed by a New York ceiling painting firm. All of the light fixtures made by Caldwell and Company, the great New York firm that also created most of Cranbrook's lighting. You can see that Kahn is relying on essentially the same firms, the same people to ornament many, many of his projects. And just as the interior is this pretty extraordinary series of Art Deco spaces leading one to the other, the exterior is also no service left unadorned. And what I think is interesting is this is a very rich architecture. I mean, the Fishers have spent money. They haven't spent the amount of money it would cost today. Labor was cheap, but these are nice materials. This is a big building. It's a tall building built by a very capable architect who's not going to let them cut corners. And I think it is showing a sign of investment in Detroit. This new center is going to be a new center. The Fisher Company will be here for good. Of course, they're subsumed into GM before the top girder goes in. But there is a sort of permanence that these buildings suggest that I think really undercut this idea of the Roaring Twenties being an anomaly for those who were living through it. I think that they thought, it was worthwhile investing in these creatures, investing in this sort of magnificence, the magic of these buildings, because the buildings were going to represent this new, great Detroit. Further downtown, we have the third Penobscot building raising up but for its two shorter sisters. And you have the beginning of this sort of growth of the Art Deco skyscraper in its telescoping form towards the ceiling, always accompanied then by a very tactile, very human relationship at the ground level, oftentimes by the Italian-American Detroit sculptor Corrado Carducci, another person many of you probably know well and better than I. And then also outfitting these new skyscrapers with the allied arts, a principle espoused here at Cranbrook, and in many cases, Cranbrook artists. Here we have an academy graduate and his wife, Clifford West, creating the mural of Michigan, students of Zoltan Zepeshy. And then how these buildings work at night, the sort of conquering of the evening in Detroit through electricity, through this giant red orb at the top of the Penobscot building. Or perhaps most dramatically at night, when it was working, was the Guardian building with these sort of rays shooting out over the misty city. It's a pretty amazing effect to come from this perhaps most interesting shape of a skyscraper. This one, like the Penobscot, designed by Wirt Rowland for Smith, Hinchman, and Grylls. You see the concrete reinforced frame going up. And then here you can see how the Guardian building is actually a very long, narrow skyscraper. And so it has a sort of almost artificial terminus where one end of it gets taller, but the skyscraper itself is really quite long and narrow to fit the long and narrow lot. It is probably the most exciting lobby in Detroit, if not America. I remember when I was first introduced to the Guardian building, I was working for Professor Kent Bloomer, and he called me before the day began and said, "You've got to get to the office. I've gotten a new book." And it was a book about the Guardian building. And we were looking together and just sort of the questions that arise of who creates this? What culture invests in this? I mean, that culture was Detroit. It was Edsel Ford. It was the bankers who together had formed the Guardian Bank system, company. Here we see a carved stone sentinel holding a key, symbolically holding the security of the bank. And then you move into the building under these great apses with different sculptural forms inspired by Native American patterns. And then you get into the lobby and you're sort of taken aback by this glass tree of life as the ceiling goes up around you. If you haven't had a chance to get to Detroit and walk through this lobby, it is owned by Wayne County. You can go anytime and explore it. It is worth sort of being knocked off your feet to go and visit the Guardian building. At the top of the steps through the Monel metal screen and the Tiffany clock, you have the main banking hall, what's now a series of shops and restaurants. And at the back, you're sort of being overlooking by a mural of Michigan and her industries by Ezra Winter. This is a depiction of all of Michigan's products, its goods and services, and how they become shipped through the waterways down to Detroit to be turned into goods. I mean, it is extraction par excellence, overseen by sort of Michigan and her industries. And then you turn around and you go through the sequence again. If you go up in the building, you come past these Tiffany stained glass windows of, again, indigenous figures abstracted in the Art Deco style. And so these are just 3 of Detroit's greatest Art Deco structures, and they really are pretty phenomenal. That only would have happened had it because of the success of the automobile industry. And this wasn't really going unnoticed. There was, I think, an amazing sort of energy that was attracting people to the city, not just those looking for work, but those looking for what the 20th century was going to be about. Now, the Guardian building is a sort of tragic tale because it was the Guardian Bank that collapsed and closed in February of 1933, leading to an extended closure of all Michigan banks for several weeks. This lack of cash flow eventually leads George Booth in helping to decide to close the arts and crafts studios here. It causes massive amounts of unemployment and suffering. And instead of being sort of guardians of the civic wealth, the Guardian Company comes to embody this sort of excessive spending, this sort of fast and loose playing with capital at the very top. But that doesn't undercut the sort of raw energy of Detroit. And I love this article written after the sort of collapse of the economy nationwide, where Ann O'Hare McCormick, visiting Detroit from New York, says, "Detroit, buoyant, girds for a new day." And she says, "Detroit is 20th century. It belongs to a period of democratized luxuries, with gas stations on every corner, chain stores, moving picture palaces, glittering automats, broadcast symphonies. In a way, Detroit is the birthplace of this civilization. It is the only true, it is as truly a world capital as any city on earth. More fascinating to the outlander than New York, I agree. More influential than Washington or even Hollywood. Paris dictates a seasoned silhouette, but Detroit manufactures a pattern of life." I mean, what a sort of statement. I wish we had anyone writing like that about any city. I mean, I would be on the next train there. And I think that as we get further along in the lecture series and we come closer to the Detroit of today, what's interesting about articles like this and quotes like this is that they mirror the sort of sense of opportunity that, again, is attracting the New York Times to write op-eds about finding Detroit over and over again. And so I think that there is this sort of rapid period of change, transformational change, that is started through the auto industry, that changes from factories that look like little mill towns to factories that are in themselves larger than any town. And it results in a radically transformed Detroit. We go from Washington Avenue, looking like a sort of bucolic garden suburb in the middle of Detroit, tall trees, individual handsome stone and brick houses, to a sort of electrified center of movie palaces, hotels, casinos, everything that one would need. Then you have the federal buildings in Detroit. At the turn of the century, I'm sure anyone who saw this go up would think Detroit's here to stay, and that building is too. Of course, it would become completely inadequate as the population is again increasing 500%. And so the federal building becomes this massive block, which undoubtedly uses some version of the contrast system to create this enormous sort of square donut wrapped, I find very pleasingly, but also very bizarrely, in a sort of stripped classical language. I think the great redeeming factor of so many of these buildings of this period in the 30s are the great carvings, the rich sort of iconography that begins to tell a city with relatively no history and a population that is from all over the world. These are the values of Detroit. These are the values of your government, of your sort of civic institutions, carved in stone on these seemingly permanent buildings. The police headquarters too would have to go from this sort of Victorian pile, kind of every architectural style that you could see in a pattern source book thrown at the subject. Utterly charming. You'd go here for Christmas cookies if it was still around. But instead we have Albert Kahn giving us a Renaissance palazzo, sort of pumped up, bigger than anything the Medicis would have ever seen, but still a much more forceful work of sort of academically correct architecture. The same goes for the police station with Hans Gerke, who was using sort of, again, a regimented language of architecture from Europe to establish Detroit's bona fides. We look at schools, they do the same thing, whether they're eclectic sort of stone and brick and timber structures to really massive high schools. This one designed in this sort of prairie style. Again, all the buildings start to look like factories wrapped in something or another once you look at enough factories. This was where Aretha Franklin and Smokey Robinson went to high school, but there are just so many kids, 4/5 of them non-English speakers, or non-American, not born in America. And Detroit is educating these kids to then join the Detroit workforce. And so you have incredible institutions like Cass Tech rising up and growing in Detroit. In 1900, the hottest thing in architecture was this very diminutive McKim, and White bank. McKim, and White, Albert Kahn's favorite architect. He said when he first saw their Metropolitan Club in Manhattan, it looks, this is Albert Kahn on McKim, and White, it looks just what it is, and I know few modern buildings that have impressed me so. These men are simply great. And so Detroit has our one little McKim, and White bank, and then that becomes sort of entirely engulfed in more buildings as Detroit gets larger and larger. And this bank, which so dominated the landscape in 1900, becomes just a little corner of the larger Penobscot block later on. Here we can compare it to, can we? Yes, to a small bank done in the Art Deco style in the 1930s. And then there were the civic institutions that needed to keep pace with a city finding itself and finding new wealth. So the Detroit Public Library moved from its incredibly charming Victorian pile and its really amazing cast iron reading room, one-room library, books all the way up to a skylight, into the sort of rural palazzo by Cass Gilbert. And the difference between, and I don't mean to insult Misters Henry T. Brush and Hugh Smith, who I don't remember anything about, is Cass Gilbert has been trained at MIT. Then he goes to the Académie des Beaux-Arts. Then he takes a 3-year grand tour. Then he sets up shop on the East Coast. And then he wins a competition to design a new city beautiful library in Detroit. He is bringing this sort of gusto to the architecture of Detroit and bringing with it a very impressive sense of classicism. Now, Cass Gilbert's library doesn't open into stacks, but becomes this sort of ennobling temple where anyone in the city, everyone is welcome in a library, can ascend the sort of marble stairs under frescoes, under mosaics, into a reading room where you can sort of have all the world's knowledge at your disposal. But where are the books? Well, library science is a real thing at this point, and so the books are hyper-industrialized on the back of the library, and there's a little factory of book maintenance and sorting and moving and tubes running behind this very serene palazzo of books in front. And then there's the problem of the art museum. What began as a sort of collection of loan paintings from prominent Detroit families, including James Edmund Scripps, the father of Cranbrook's co-founder Ellen Scripps Booth, was by 1919 gifted entirely to the city. So it went from essentially a private wealthy club of paintings open to the public to a city-owned collection of art. And it needed to have a building that reflected the prominence of the city's collection and the sort of greatness of the collection and its ambition. Albert Kahn was at this point serving on the advisory board of the Detroit Institute of Arts, and he heavily favored Philippe Cret, a Philadelphia architect who had been born in Lyon, France, trained at the Académie des Beaux-Arts, and brought the sort of French method of teaching to America. Cret brought a very formal system of academic French training and Beaux-Arts space planning, but he also was paired with a director of the museum, Valentiner, for wholly new ideas in how to lay out a museum. Instead of sort of endless galleries, one after the other, they thought, why can't a museum recall the charm of a European palace gallery? Why can't art be, instead of divided by painting, sculpture, and my favorite category at the old museum, bric-a-brac? Your art should be divided instead by the cultures that it comes from. Italian art, so Italian painting, textiles, furniture, architectural elements. French art, bring an entire Gothic chapel, and that you should move through these spaces as sort of fully immersive teaching tools. Of course, one of those importantly was the American wing, a relatively new introduction to fine art at the time, where they bring an entire house from Pennsylvania and put it into the building. And so Philippe Cret's success as a building in sort of announcing Detroit's arrival on the world stage as a cultural capital was, one could say, missing just one component. And that is, of course, the great intersection of our incredibly ambitious city, beautiful, our sort of city infrastructure, with the automotive industry that was making it all possible. On the right, I'm showing Philippe Cret's ideal version of the garden court, which is simply specimen koi fish, specimen ferns, and a couple of tapestries in a room that's meant to reset you before going back into the galleries. It had off-white walls and travertine stone and lots of sunlight. And what would very quickly happen in 1933 was the introduction of the Spanish or Mexican communist artist Diego Rivera, his wife Frida Kahlo, and here Albert Kahn, who was the great supporter of this project. And through the finances of Edsel Ford, we're given the murals, the Rivera frescoes at the DIA. And Rivera comes to Detroit. Frida Kahlo describes him as being like a child with a new toy, so obsessed he is with the world of Henry Ford. He spends extensive amounts of time studying the Rouge plant, studying the auto industry in Detroit, getting excited about the work, and then he comes and he ornaments the walls of the DIA with frescoes that aren't so much about the factory, they're really not about the car, there's only one car. Instead, it is about extraction, it's about making, it's about individuals, it's about the work of the individual, the collective good. I'm not an art historian, nor do I work at the DIA, so I won't analyze these murals today in front of all of you, but I encourage you to think about what it means to have a city that was so sort of small and frontier in 1900. By 1930, be this kind of dominated by Art Deco skyscrapers, incredible civic infrastructure, huge new products, a population that has increased substantially, and then you bring the sort of chaos, the cacophony of industry, the madness of the auto industry, and you put it onto the very walls of the museum through the hands of an utter outsider, a Mexican communist who is sort of observing this all with, I think, more than just a wink and nod. It is a sort of fascinating conclusion to today's lecture in thinking about Detroit at this moment, where it is all speed, all growth, and all sort of engines firing straight ahead. Next week, we'll look at a whole different side of this area. We'll look at the residential architecture. We'll look at the immigrant enclaves. We'll look at the people who shaped the sort of pedestrian side of Detroit, those who responded against the auto industry, against the scale of the factory, against the scale of the city beautiful. And we will continue to examine Detroit's place in the architectural world. Thank you, everyone. And I think we do have 10 minutes for questions. So I see Miriam has a microphone. If you are on Zoom, thanks for being here. If you want to type in a question, I will be able to take those from the podium. And if you're in the audience, we have our first question.
What happened? Why wasn't it scratched?
You know, the amount of rabbit holes that I went down in preparing for this lecture series, I did not read much about the Fishers. I mean, they made the body, General Motors made the engines. Eventually, the companies are merged, are sold. And so once the crash happens, I mean, all these buildings are opening months before the crash. And then once the Guardian collapses in 33, it really is the end of this type of building in Detroit. One could say the end of this scale of building to today. I mean, the transformational change that I was trying to show there at the end with the sort of 1900, 1930, 1900, 1930. We can't do that for any of the other lectures. If we do, we might be a little more forlorn. And so I think that the kind of ambition of a project like that is as much for that rendering by Hugh Ferris. Look at what Detroit can do. As the Fishers ever thought to do that, they didn't need a skyscraper. They were leasing most of it out. That's why they put the retail shops, the shopping mall, the hair salon, the club, the restaurants. That's why they have all the leasable office space. Swanson and Saarinen lease space in that building as an architecture firm. They really don't need a mega block, you know, twice as tall tower. So it's a lot of bluster that resulted in 1/3 of a perfect building. Apparently I said 140 acres. Detroit is 138 point something square miles, not acres. Any other questions?
Maybe not tonight, but next time can you identify all buildings that are on the poster?
Oh, the question is about our wonderful poster. Can we identify the buildings? Sure, we'll wait and see if anyone wants to do it themselves. And then, yeah, maybe we'll go through the poster and see what all is there. Other questions? Well, oh, we have one. Why isn't Albert Kahn as well known as Frank Lloyd Wright? You know, I think that Albert Kahn is a brilliant architect. He's a very nice person. He seems to have been very beloved in Detroit, both by his family, his colleagues, his associates. When he dies, his son, who is a medical doctor at the University of Michigan, serving in London. He learns about his father's death on the front page of the London papers. Albert Kahn's death of a heart attack when he's 73 is internationally significant news. But I think that he was famous because he was the architect of the arsenal of democracy, because he was the person who had created an architecture that allowed modern society to exist. And that is a hard thing to stay famous for, in part because the sort of progress is always moving forward. So there's always something new, and he's not there to do it. Partly because people like Frank Lloyd Wright were incredibly brand conscious. They were also incredibly identified with hyper-specific, relatively small projects that they marketed within an inch of their life. Someone like Eero Saarinen, who actually disappears entirely from our sort of architecture history for 30 years and then comes back. The second Mrs. Saarinen was the world's first in-house architectural PR person. And Albert Kahn doesn't have any of that, nor do his buildings particularly lend themselves to repeated sort of running up the flagpole about how wonderful they are. Many of the factories, of course, don't survive. Many have been demolished, adapted. They have been completely sort of subsumed in other buildings or in other projects. They've been demolished. You think about all of those factories in Europe that are now UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And then poor Albert Kahn, hardly can get a city plaque outside of some of his buildings. He also built 400, so maybe they're not all landmarks. But I think that Albert Kahn, his legacy, his impact is so specific to sort of technology, to industry, to making this industrial production revolution possible, that the aesthetics of the building are lost.
Would you care to, even though it's a little bit out of Detroit, would you care to comment on the Willow Run plant and its significance?
Oh gosh, not today. Good answer. No, I mean, some of the big projects are absolutely insane. And in some of the advertisements about these factories, I think it's Willow Run where they put it over Manhattan and it can't fit on Manhattan. Like some of these factories just get so ludicrously large. Or the story of going for one of the bomber plants when World War II starts, they go 11 days from field to operations. That's insane. That is insane. And it's because just as Ford had trained his team to be completely replaceable, Albert Kahn wasn't quite that bad. I mean, when Ford offers the $5 a day, he was having a 400% turnover rate, which meant he was hiring, 400 people to make 100 people's work. And so Henry Ford's just like, I'll give them more money because the job is utterly pointless. Like they just are putting this thing on. It's all very gloomy. But Albert Kahn is doing a little bit the same thing with his buildings. It's like, here's how you turn a corner. Here's how you lay a pipe. Here's how you install a restroom. And so instead of going from design to engineering, to mechanical engineering, to structural engineering, they would work all together all at once. And then they would put the plans together and resolve the conflicts, but just with this assumption that what they were doing was going to be supported by every other person at the Kahn office. And in the vast majority of times, I get this sense that it's like, you're resolving an A or B, but you are not creating a new solution C. And so they could design these buildings at an incredible clip because the sort of individual expertise was so deep. Good question. Good avoiding the question. Okay. Any other questions? Well, we have much more to learn about Detroit. It's rise, it's fall, it's overblown, rumors of its death. This is going to be a great lecture series. I'm excited to go through it with you. And if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please send them into my email. See you next Tuesday, everyone.